Evening, everyone, and welcome to Chez Zee. I'm Cari Clark. I'm your co-host and moderator. This is my passion project. By day, I help buyers and sellers with their real estate needs at Sotheby's International here in Austin. So I hope if you ever need to buy or sell a house or have a friend who needs to, you'll think of me. I put some bookmarks on your table. It's kind of a fun takeaway, so please take those home with you. Tonight we have Jan Jarboe Russell, thanks to Evan Taniguchi, who connected us. I want to tell you a little bit about Jan, and then we're going to start to talk about her most recent work. She's a native Texan, a UT graduate, and this evening I learned that she went to school with my father's second wife, Pamela Mayo Clark, just all in the family. She's been a newspaper reporter, off and on several different times. She's worked at Texas Monthly as a writer and an editor. In 1999, she published her well-received biography of Lady Bird Johnson, which I personally devoured several years ago. She spent 4 years working on this book, The Train to Crystal City, which was published in 2015. And she lives in San Antonio, so she had to drive up I-35 to be with us this evening. So, yeah, an extra thank you for that. So why don't we start off this evening with you giving our guests a summary of the book in case they have not read it.
Is that better? First of all, I really do want to talk about how I first found out about this book. And when I was at UT, I was introduced to Evan's father, and I was immediately intimidated by him, Alan Taniguchi, and because he was very, very right to the point and everything. And the thing was that when I went to interview him, I asked him, well, where are you from? You know, he looked like a Japanese, but I had never really seen a Japanese person in my life. And he said, well, I'm from Texas. And he said, well, how did you get here? And he said, well, my family was in camp. And I said, church camp? And this was the beginning of a great relationship with Alan Taniguchi. And I got to know about the internment camp at Crystal City from him and from his father, Izumi, who is a character in the book. And so I was one of those girls that would go over to the Taniguchi garden, which wasn't a garden then, it was just the garden, and watched Izumi pick up things that were really heavy and to literally make the garden himself. And I do believe that garden, the Taniguchi garden, is the heart of Austin and the heart of Texas, because what Izumi was working for was peace, and he had seen enough of war, and so I do think that it starts the book. And I waited too late to get information from Alan in detail about the Crystal City camp, but I went to Evan and I asked Evan, can you help me out? And so Evan gave me what he had, which was the most important part, was that he made that his father, Alan, had made a list of people that were in the camp and that were as children, and so I quit the job I had and started getting on airplanes and interviewing all of the people on Alan's list. And the Japanese were the first, but then he did in fact know some of the Germans, and there were only a few other kinds of people there, but those were the two big groups. So this is the way it started, you know. And I thought it was going to be easy. I was going to go around, and I was going to talk to people, and they were going to give me their stories, and I would put it in. But what I found out is that the children in the camp didn't know why they were in the camp. They had no earthly idea why they were in the camp, and their parents would not talk about it very much. And so they themselves couldn't really help me. They could tell me, oh, we did tofu, or oh, we did a dance, or oh, we were in this little barrack or stuff, but they had a child's view of what the camp was. And so I then went to Crystal City. I thought, oh, it's 120 miles from my home in San Antonio. It's not going to be a problem. I'll just go down there to Crystal City and pick up some information, write the book in 2 weeks, and get the thing done. I go down to Crystal City, and guess what? Nobody in there knew about why they had the internment camp. They knew there was an internment camp, no earthly idea of why they had it. And so then I realized I was in deep trouble. And so I had to go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And all the things about the Crystal City camp you couldn't touch them. They had not been released. So it's a good thing when you're a journalist, you know how to do things. So I provided all the information to get them released. So that took, a long time to do. And then I spent the entire summer working through those files, and that made the book. And so the structure of the book is about why the United States under Franklin Roosevelt, why he wanted to have a secret camp in what many people said was like, what did I say? It was Siberia. It was Siberia of the United States. Why would you want the southern Siberia of the United States? And that was because we didn't know that it was really the important thing about the camp is that it was a prisoner exchange camp. And so that I did not find until 3 years into the book, because that I had to go to with the State Department and get those records declassified. So this was a real killer in terms of finding the information. But that is what created the book, because the prisoner exchange program it takes us out of Texas for sure, but it shows you what we were dealing with during World War II. Can I just stop at that point and ask?
So we know. So why don't you describe Crystal City a little bit for us? I know that there were 4,000 people there at the peak. Yeah. Kind of tell us so we know it's a camp. We know it's in the valley. It's about 40 miles south of...
It's not really the valley.
No. Okay, no, not in the valley? Okay. It's 40 miles south of Uvalde.
Yeah. It's 30 miles from Mexico in the camp. And the camp, I have a thing in the book that explains all about what the camp was. And you can see that it was against the Geneva Convention to have both Japanese, Germans, and a few Italians in that camp. And so they had to cordon off the Japanese side from the German side. And and so you can see here in this thing exactly what happens. They also had a big citrus drowned, and so they had, and so that would have been something that Azumi would have worked at that, since he was really good with that kind of thing. The problem was that the people that were arrested were the men. They were arrested, and then when they were arrested, then the government says, well, what are we going to do with our families and stuff? And the government then says, well, we'll take you, you can come to Crystal City and you can keep your family intact. And that wasn't, and so they did go to Crystal City, and the way it was described by Ingrid and some of the other people to me is that when they got to Crystal City, they saw, what do you call those things, tumbleweeds? Tumbleweeds were going down the whole city. There was just, dirt on the, there was nothing. And then they had that thing of Popeye, the Popeye statue, and everything was so bleak, and the Mexican Americans lived on one side of the street, and the Anglos were on this side of the street, and there was plenty of fighting back and forth. And so I remember that Sumi, one of the characters in the book, looked at it, who was from Los Angeles and thought she was, hot stuff, and she looked out and she said, "They brought us to a movie. This is a movie. We're not going to go to jail. This is some kind of a movie." And so that's the way. What I loved in hearing all the children's stories is that they refused to. They always made it something fun, because what else could they do in a way? Meanwhile, their parents were in really, really terrible difficulties. So if they signed that thing that said they were coming into Crystal City, they had to sign an affidavit saying that if they were taken from Crystal City, they had to go with their family to where they were going. That should have been an idea that I would have gotten, that there was a prisoner exchange program, but until this book, those two things had not yet come together.
That was going to be one of my questions. So in your research, were you the first person to uncover, or the prisoner exchange only happened through Crystal City detainees?
No, there were other there were other people that were also on the Gripsholm from other camps, but the majority of them were all taken from Crystal City.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because I think a lot of people know that there were internment camps in the U.S., but a lot of people did not know, and maybe you were the first person to uncover it, that there was a prisoner exchange. And tell us about that, because several of the characters in the book, it happened towards the end of the war, so whole families had to go to Germany or to Japan. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, the prisoner exchange was, near the end of the war. President Roosevelt was wanting to get everybody out, every American out, and he wanted to do that since the beginning of the war. But as the war went on, he really wanted to get everybody out, and so he came up with this prisoner exchange program. And so what he did was trade the men and the women and the children in Crystal City, a group of them, for more important Americans. Remember, all of the children, most of the children in Crystal City were born in the United States, and their father had been designated a bad guys, and the mothers went along. So that they had 6 different prisoner exchanges, and they all came out of this camp, and so in return he wanted to get back any business people that were still left over. There were also nuns and other kinds of people. I mean, it was war. I mean, and I make that very clear in the book. It's very difficult to say these guys are right and these guys are wrong. But anyway, And so they were exchanged, but most of the time it was American kids exchanged for Japanese kids or for
Because
German
there were more
kids.
of them, like
Yes.
a family of 6. So
Yes.
you had,
Yes. And so they were exchanged like that. So you had Americans going into these war zones. It's the end of the war, and soldiers and other people coming out. And actually, I had to study up on the prisoner exchange program because it started with George Washington. He was the only person who never used it happened to be Johnson. He did not use it, but almost every president up until that time had a prisoner exchange program. And so this is a whole aspect that I did not know, and that's the way it is. If I could, I have this one piece that I could read that might make it easier for you to understand, and because what we're talking about here is a lot of information, and this involves. This is it. I explained that the camp was the center of FDR's prisoners exchange. Hundreds of prisoners in Crystal City, including their children, were exchanged for other ostensibly more important Americans behind enemy lines in Germany. So what I'm going to talk to you about is about what happened to one single family, this family, German family from Strongsville, Ohio, who were interned in Crystal City, and they were traded back to Germany in the prisoner exchange. And so you'll hear the characters. The characters were Matthias, the father, who was the one who was designated not a good person, Joanna, his wife, their daughters Ingrid and Ensi, and their sons Lothar, and a newborn baby who was born on the train, Gunther. So this is.
he was born on the train going to
going
yeah.
into train.
No,
Yeah.
coming out.
Yeah,
Crystal
yes,
City.
we did. So I just wanted to
On the prisoner exchange.
This is one thing that gives you an idea of how it felt in 1945. When we were coming out. The train chugged out of the station in Frankfurt at an even pace. About 8 kilometers east of Idstein, the train slowed to enter a tunnel. The conductor blew the whistle once, and a second blast filled the air. The train lurched forward and picked up speed. The passengers straightened in their seats. Then Ingrid heard the sounds of airplanes above the train, followed by blasts of machine gun fire. She and her father moved to the end of the train and looked outside. 8 American P-38s flew above them, each mounted with 2 4-barrel machine guns. "Attack, attack," yelled the conductor in German. Ensi watched the scene from the window seat. Her mother, cradling Gunther, had the aisle seat. "Get down," ordered Joanna. Ensi didn't move. Eyes opened wide, she strained to see the action as machine gun bullets hit the side of the train. Joanna slapped Ensi's face and pushed her under the seat. "Keep your face down," she cried. "Don't look up." The train slowed and came to a stop. As the passengers cautiously emerged from beneath the seats, the conductor ordered everyone off the train. Matthias pointed to a 10-foot embankment that led into a grove of trees. "Let's go," he ordered. All 6 of the family hurried up the hill. When Ingrid looked over her shoulder, she saw her mother flat on the ground with Matthias crouched over her. Joanna had fallen, and her father dragged Joanna to her knees and then to her feet. Together they pushed up the hill. At the top of the hill, they fixed their eyes on the train, stopped on the tracks, and the American planes that circled it. The conductor blew the whistle to signal that the train was leaving. The Israels hurried down the hill and reboarded the train as the battle continued. The American planes swooped over the rails and fell low to the ground, their machine guns hitting to the right of the train and to the left. German soldiers returned the fire from 2 anti-aircraft guns attached to the train. one gun on the last car, the other just behind the locomotive. As Lothar and Ingrid watched from their seats, each saw a P-38 hit by German fire. The American pilot ejected from his plane with a parachute and landed in a tree, his body riddled with bullets. Then a second plane was hit and went down on the other side of the train. Incy watched as the plane plunged to the ground, leaving a spiral trail of black soot. None of the German soldiers were killed, and the 6 remaining P-38s retreated. Lothar looked at his mother, who was in a daze. When she spoke, she said that she was relieved that their family was all alive, but remorseful for the 2 American pilots who were killed. The irony of American flyboys shooting at my American-born children, she told him. I'll never understand it. Both Lothar and Ingrid were shaken from traveling between 2 distinct worlds, America and Germany. One part of them was still in Crystal City, Texas, and the other faced the reality that their lives had been saved by German soldiers firing on American pilots. And and the same thing happened to the Japanese when they were going into it at the war, when they were taken there. Horrible, terrible, terrible things. And as a writer, one thing that I have focused on in my life is it's sort of a Job story. You know, to try to be able to listen to the suffering of people, because we all suffer, and then to follow the suffering and into how they can make a life for themselves, how they can forgive. And that part of the story is the end of the book, and I was just constantly amazed when one Japanese person and one Japanese Americans and German Americans would say, you know, this was what we did, this happens, and we have to move on. The many lessons in the book that the children of Crystal City who are important enough for us to be able to take in our own lives when we are sick, when we have been mistreated, but is to how do you take on that and somehow build your life with it.
Do you think that the Japanese, because of their religion and kind of their upbringing about endure the endurable, did better than the Germans did, or do you have a sense of that?
I definitely know that the Japanese did that, and by that time, the Germans, by the time of the war was there, were in the same situation, the other thing that's strange is that how most of the kids that were taken, the ones that came back to the United States, they earned enough money in Germany and in Japan to come back to the United States without their parents, because the parents had no jobs. But then once they had enough money, the children, they brought the parents back to the United States. So I think the whole subject of immigration is so on our minds now that this is not the same kind of situation that we're living now, but it's close enough. And it's interesting to me that many of the children that have been taken are migrant children from different countries have been held in an area just down the street from where the camp was. So it's it's constantly going on. We have not had the conversation that we must have about if they're an immigrant and they're here on their own and they have done all their stuff, we have to call them Americans and stop fooling around and sending them here and there and everywhere. And so,
Well, I would like to kind of shift gears and just kind of really focus in on the Taniguchi family.
Yeah.
I too got to meet Mr. Taniguchi as a girl, because my father was very involved in the the men's garden club, and I remember him fondly because he was really the first foreigner that I had ever seen, and I had to go look at pictures because I had remembered him in a magical way, because he was very magical, and he didn't look the same as I remembered him as a little girl, because I can remember just being wide-eyed because he was so dark and sinewy, and he's working. I'd never seen anybody work like that before. So I want you to tell us how the Taniguchi family came to Crystal City.
well, it was the older of the guy and his wife came to Crystal City, and
Mr. Taniguchi.
Mr. Taniguchi, and by that time his sons were both in college, and they went to college, and so they didn't go with them, and I don't exactly understand. I think that after a certain time, if you're 18 or 16, then they went to college, and there's a piece in here where I talk about Alan going. There was some interruptions that were happening on the Japanese side of the camp, and Alan went to talk to the head man and went to talk to the Japanese people, the ones that were really, really infuriated about what was happening to them, and settled it down. And that was Alan's role. I'd like to ask. I wish Alan were still here, because I think that was a very difficult time for him to be separated, and he in fact became the head of the family, and his father was in this camp and wasn't the head of the family, and I think that there was some serious tensions there. That was true of almost all of the men in the camp. They felt emasculated by the government, because the ones that had children, the government was saying, you can go to this dance, you can go to that dance, and in the Japanese culture, that really didn't fly, because the Japanese mother and father wanted to be able to say that where their children could go, even in a camp like that. The Japanese kids that were there, especially the boys that were in 11 and 12, they were the ones that would go up with the guards at night, and they would just talk to them, and they would sing that song, "Oh, give me land, lots of land under sorry times above, don't fence me in," and they thought they were really, really funny about that, and the guards were laughing about it too. So
Alan went to college, and many of the things, one of the most ironic things that I found was that the government recruited the sons of these interned families to serve in the military.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Like, we're talking 4,000 of them.
Yeah.
So the youngest Taniguchi son, so Alan's brother, ends up volunteering for the army, much to his father's dismay. So it caused a lot of conflict between, so the government was asking these people who'd been interred to let their sons go off and fight for the U.S. government while they're being imprisoned. And it caused a lot of conflict in this family confusion that you were just discussing. So he goes, so this is one of the conflicts in the Taniguchi family. So the younger brother goes off to war. Alan goes to college and is kind of there for his family. And what happened to that brother? So
He actually he went back to California and worked as what was it, Evan?
Well, he was an economist.
An economist.
He came back from the war.
He actually was the head of the School of Economics at Fresno State.
That's what to say
He
back.
got his doctorate at UT and U of H.
Yes.
Texas.
So he was a smart dude, and was on his own like that.
And Mr. Taniguchi, he was a farmer in California before he was arrested. And tell us what he was arrested for. Do you remember? I know you wrote this book a while ago.
Yeah, I mean, he was arrested because he was an enemy alien.
Yeah, they said it was because he was blowing smoke signals to Japan.
Oh,
He
yeah,
was
blowing
buying his
smoke
crops.
signals. He had these crops, that's right. I forgot this part of the book. He had these crops, and a group of them. He was a very well-received and regarded man. And he had he had a huge factory and sent tomatoes to New York and so he was
Because this is in the 40s.
Yeah,
So
he was a
people to
he was a
ship
genius.
Produce from California to the East Coast.
And at that time, they were always flying over to see if any of these Japanese people were signaling to the. It's a crazy story, but signaling to people that this is how it should go. Yeah, right.
So, you know, I talk about this all the time. I don't want to take the show away, but
No.
this is really
It's
part of
interesting.
it all, because my grandfather was one of the most successful farmers
Right.
in the Bay Area at that time, and he actually formed a cooperative. This had never been
That's
heard
right.
of before. A cooperative of Japanese farmers. So they put all the resources. I think I speak loud enough. They put all the resources together and made this cooperative. They shared the shed, they shared all the equipment, and they shared a lot of things. And this was never heard of before, but they would have meetings. They would have these agricultural cooperative meetings. The FBI actually thought that they were having secret espionage meetings for the emperor. So like Jan was saying earlier, when my grandfather was picked up by the FBI, they were accusing him of espionage, of when they would, the tomato plants, you know, in the winter, when it was cold, they would put the smudge pots out and they would see the smoke. And the FBI said that they were signaling to the Japanese ships out in the ocean. When they would plant their crops, they would plant them in a row. And the FBI said they were pointing a certain direction with their crop, the rows of their crops, pointing to where they were supposed to be coming in to attack the United States. I mean, there was so much hysteria that,
Yeah, and so this happened to person after person who were
Yes.
Japanese born, and they made up reasons. And of course, none of these people were charged with crimes.
Yes.
And so there's a whole legal component to
And-
Jan's book
yeah.
that's very interesting as well.
They couldn't be charged with crimes, and they never could find someone to help them at all. And so that was really terrible.
And so Mr. Taniguchi, he worked at Crystal City. He worked, everybody in Crystal City, you could have a job.
Right.
And he worked in the carpentry shop, but in his spare time, he worked in the gardens, of course, because there was a garden and an orchard. The Germans built a swimming pool. But there was this thing called the the loyalty test that the young men had to take and to decide whether they were going to go into the military or not. And talk a little bit about that. We've got about 5 more minutes.
Well, you're going to have to help me with this, but I do know that Alan would not do the no.
Yeah.
He would not do the no, and this was a very brave.
It's a questionnaire to
Right.
check your loyalty.
Are you?
And
Yeah.
Alan
Wouldn't do it.
wouldn't say either way.
He wouldn't, and I think that really had an impact on the people that came behind him, and so that he was very, very influential as we know, once he made up his mind, he was going to do it. And so he had a very unusual experience during the war because of his ability to say, I'm going to do this and I'm not going to do that.
In your book, you say that Mr. Taniguchi, and it's Isamu, right? Evan? Isamu. This is Evan's grandfather. My dad always referred to him as Old Man Taniguchi, which now I realize is not very respectful. Oh, you're Old Man Taniguchi now. Okay. But you say that he was schooled in the art and philosophy of horticulture. Can you tell me a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, that is a quote from him. From him, and he had written several things about it, and so that's actually it's a smaller version than his, but he is the one who.
Yeah, I love that, the philosophy of horticulture.
Well, if in Japan, that is the way they regard it. It's so he was speaking. Yes, sir.
So before I open up the floor, which I usually do right about this time, 7:15, I wanted to introduce Amy Voorhees, who's here with the Zilker Botanical Garden Conservancy, and she's going to talk a little bit about the Taniguchi Garden.
Yay! That's great.
What an honor to be here with Jan, Jarboe, Russell, and to hear this important story about Austin's history and its present. I'm here because I serve on the board of the Zilker Botanical Garden Conservancy, and we are committed to restoring the Zilker Botanical Garden and making it truly the haven that it has the potential to be. How many of you have been to the Zilker Botanical Garden? Oh, okay. So you know that it really is the heart of Austin. It's right downtown. One thing that I think makes that so special, and the Taniguchi story exemplifies it, is the Zilker Botanical Garden is the antithesis of the Waller Creek Garden that's being developed right now. We didn't have a fancy New Yorker come in here and redesign everything. This is a garden that was built by hand, by Texans, by volunteers, by people like Mr. Taniguchi, who put their heart and soul into that garden. And they created a very special place. One of the things that we do with the Conservancy is help raise the funds to restore and beautify that garden. It has been under the city's control for a long time, and the city decided, we are not really in the business of running a botanical garden. That's kind of out of our skill set, and so we have been collaborating with the city. But the big breakthrough is we are able to raise funds and keep them in the garden. So when we raise money, we can make sure that those enhancements are actually taking place and they're not being siphoned off into the general operating fund for the city. So all of a sudden we have gardeners who are taking care of this wonderful asset that we have here in Austin. And some of you on your tables have a flyer about our Starlight Social. This is the 50th anniversary of the Zilker Botanical Garden, the Taniguchi Garden.
The Taniguchi Garden.
So 50 years ago, for a project for his retirement, Mr. Taniguchi started carving this garden out of these caliche hills. And every day he would go to work and build this garden, and it is a phenomenal creation, and it's so beautiful. But it also needs a little more love today, because when he built it, he wasn't building it to meet the current construction guidelines. He was building it as a labor of love. But now to make sure that this is a haven for our children and their children, we need to be investing in these very important public spaces. So that's why we are holding the Starlight Social on April 11th. It's a Thursday. And it is the best party in Austin.
It is. Peter was there. He knows.
You don't usually get to go in the garden at night. We are going to have twilight tours of the garden. There are sushi and sake tastings. There will be calligraphy lessons and a tea demonstration. It is fun. It's a really great party. And if you buy your tickets now, you can get them at the very special early bird rate of $100. And that money goes straight to the garden because all of the elements of the party are being donated by really generous vendors here in town.
Hey,
So
which night is it? Sorry, you.
it's Thursday, April 11th. And to buy your tickets, you can just go to the Zilker Garden website, and that is zilkergarden.org. So please help us honor this important legacy. Help us honor Evan and his family and all they've done for Austin by coming to this party and bringing all your friends. So thank you very much.
Okay, the other announcements I have before question and answer from the audience is we'll have Bill Whitliff here April the 9th and Mimi Schwartz here on May the 14th and Wyatt McSpadden on June the 11th. Okay, so we have questions from the audience. Let's start with Jim over here. Uh-oh, someone will have to take that too.
Would you run that over?
I think they can hear me.
I
wonder, Jan, in your work, have you found that the Germans and the
Here,
Japanese...
use the mic. We can't hear you.
Okay, you cannot hear, okay. Jan, have the Germans and the Japanese forgiven us of what we did to them during World War II? I know that at one time the government paid back to the Japanese, I know, some of their losses that we took away from them, like their farms and their houses and things like that. Have you felt the forgiveness?
Well, some have forgiven and some haven't. I just wanted to say the Japanese were given a certain amount of money from President Reagan. The Germans have never asked for money, but now their descendants are beginning, because the Germans felt ashamed because of the Holocaust. I just have to say it. And so now some of their children are attempting to get Congress not to give money, but to give a recognition of harm done to American Germans and this is a very difficult thing that's going on. Joaquin Castro has put in a plan, and partly because of this book, and so I don't know how long that would take. The terrible problem, as Evan knows, is that day by day by day we lose these people, and so I'm hoping it happens. And remember that in Germany, when they were discussing with the Americans at the end of the war, they really turned on. They said, "Look what you did to the Japanese." The Germans said, "You don't have any. You haven't done anything that we didn't do," which wasn't true. But this is also a good idea not to get involved in this kind of stuff, because at the end of the game, it just leaves everybody mad, you know. So I don't know. I do know this, that most of the people that were in the camp that came consider themselves very much American, very much. Lotar had secret security clearance.
We're talking the children mostly
Yeah,
did, yeah.
yes, yes. The children
Yeah,
are now
children. Yeah, now they're
older than
adults,
me,
right,
which is
right.
pretty old. And so,
The people who were children.
yeah. And is there anybody?
Absolutely, they consider themselves Americans.
Yeah,
And that's why it was so confusing when they were repatriated.
right.
They weren't really repatriated,
Because
they weren't born
They
there.
weren't born here.
Yeah.
That was another mistake we made.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lots.
And, I know y'all have more questions. Anybody else? Here we got one over
So,
here.
it didn't matter whether you were a citizen or not, correct?
No. A lot of these people were citizens.
Yes.
Legal.
Yeah, well, a lot, like most of all of the children were, all of the children,
Yeah, I'm talking about the parents.
but the parents, and you know, my father fought in World War II, and I know there are some of us that are still in this, and you know, we have to ease up on this is the kind of thing that happens in war, which is why we shouldn't have in another one. we need to try to do something better, and so if there was a guy that looked like out of whack, like you get these crazy ideas. We were talking about the Japanese. Well, the Germans had the same thing. The Germans were telling on each other, oh no, I'm a good American, the guy next door is a bad one. And that's the kind of the ways that it was going. Yes,
But it couldn't happen today, let's say.
it could happen today.
It is happening.
Yeah, it's here.
And then just a second. It's true.
I don't have a question, but I have kind of an answer to that. You know, I don't think it's citizens. I think it's immigrants. I think our country is made up of immigrants. You know, it's very poignant that Jan's book came out when it did, because after that, you know, your POTUS was elected, y'all's POTUS, not mine. he was elected, and right after he was elected, I got all these calls that I've told everybody. I've spoken at 25 book clubs around Austin. You know, I didn't even know there were that many book clubs, but they were all friends of mine who knew that I was an outspoken proponent for civil rights and constitutional rights. So my talk was based more on history repeating itself. I think they called me because they knew that my family had suffered those injustices, and they wanted me to send out that message that this book very much points out what it could be like now and in the future, whether you're an immigrant, you're a citizen, or whatever. And I think that's what I really got the most out of this book, you know, and I've been so happy and proud. I learned more after Jan wrote this book. I learned more about the Japanese American situation than I ever knew, because like she said earlier, you know, our families didn't talk about this. This was the dark days. This was something you didn't want to talk about. But now that it's out there, I'm so happy to have been educated in this and to be able to go out and speak about history not getting back to this same place again. So.
Let's do this one behind.
More of a statement.
Okay.
A question? Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Well, I don't have a question, but I have a little anecdote about Alan and his wife, Leslie.
Yes.
I think the Taniguchi family has done more for Austin than any other single family that I can recall. But I had the privilege in 1986 of accompanying the Taniguchis and a large contingent of people from Austin to Japan to meet with some of the business community, business leaders, and interest them in the Austin-San Antonio corridor. One day, Alan said, Bob, I have a meeting with a very large Japanese company, and they are in a similar business to you, and would you like to accompany me and just make an introduction, and after you have made your introduction, you will need to leave because I have a business meeting. So I said, thank you, Alan, I would love to. Well, we went across Tokyo to this high-rise, beautiful bank building with the name on it as the same as the company that Alan was meeting with. We were escorted into near the major conference room, and after a few minutes, we were invited to enter the conference room. And there was a conference table longer than this room with probably 20 or 30 Japanese gentlemen, all in black suits, white shirts, and black neckties. At the end of the conference table, there was an empty chair. In a little bit, this little small gentleman came in, and everybody jumped up, stood up, and he sat down. Everybody bowed, and then we all sat down. There were a few introductory remarks, and then the master of ceremonies, so to speak, said, sir, we have two guests today. I would like to introduce our friend, Mr. Alan Taniguchi from Austin, and his friend. And I stood up and said, my name is Bob Shipman. I am from Austin also. We are in a similar line of business. And I said, actually, we're building a plant for Sharp Electronics in New Jersey. And this little gentleman at the end of the table went, yes, I know. For 300 years, my company has constructed every facility for Sharp Electronics until now. Good intro. I said, pleasure to be here. Left the room. The next morning, I saw Alan at breakfast. And he said, Bob, you made quite an appearance yesterday.
I have more of a statement to make than a question. I was recommended this book, and I also read the article in the San Antonio Express about it when your book came out. And when I got it, what impressed me was the fact that you dedicated it to Maury Maverick Jr. And I grew up around the Maverick family, and I knew they were so involved in civil rights. And I knew at that point this was going to be a book I was going to really enjoy and know it was going to be done fairly for both sides. And so that's my
Thank you.
statement.
Thank you.
That your dedication made me
Thank you.
plow through it. So.
Maury Maverick is the one who kept saying that I had to go see Alan Taniguchi.
Yes.
And so he would call me every morning and say, Maury would call me every morning and say, what have you done for your country today? And I said, well, it's still in my pajamas. And he said, well, get out of there and get going.
My whole family was like that.
That's right.
They were.
So Dan, I have
Yeah.
a great story about that.
About Maury and Alan.
Maury and John Henry Falk. John Henry Falk had a place on Lake Travis.
Right.
My dad would take us out there, and one time we were sitting out there on the dock or something, and these fighter pilots, because Bergstrom was a
Right.
fighter place, these fighter pilots would fly by, and both of them were shooting the finger at the jets. All them together.
Those were the days.
One other thing, I don't know if they'd like to tell it, but this couple here has a very interesting story about a family member in the military during World War II that was impacted by the camps.
Would you like to share that with us?
Yes, that'd be great, thank you. Well, I grew up with some of my relatives that were actually interned in the camps, and my father decided to go ahead and go into the Army. He was in his second year of college, and he would have been at Camp Minidoka, but he chose to go into the Army, and he was an interpreter during the war. So he knew he was going to be shipped out to Japan. He had his full dress U.S. Army uniform on. His sister was at Minidoka, and he wanted to visit her before he got shipped out. So he went there, uniform on and everything, and he was denied simply because he was Japanese. So he did not get to see his sister before that. And I grew up knowing these things, and we don't realize how precious our freedom really is. My grandparents were fortunate; they survived. My aunt survived, the one that was at Minidoka, but that was something that they tried to tell us, and we didn't fully grasp it growing up until our later years, that I realized how important our freedom is. And all of the lives that were lost by the American military that were like the 442 and the other people that were fighting for our freedom, it really matters. And I know this gentleman was saying that could this happen again, that our constitutional rights would be denied. And I said, yes, it could happen. And so we have to be very vigilant. But I just wanted to share that story.
Thank you. Thank you.
That same thing has happened with the Mexican Americans who've been taken into the Army or the services and then denied citizenship. So it's not, it's not
it is happening.
Somebody's writing that book.
So the 442 was a regiment made up of all second Japanese. The 442 that you referred to is a regiment that was made up of they served mostly in Italy. It made up of all pretty much second or first generation Japanese sons, and mostly of their fathers were in families were in camps. All right, it's 7:30. It's usually when we wrap up. Does anyone have any last? Okay, Annette.
I just wanted to commend Jan for writing the book. I think it does two extraordinary things, both of which are so necessary in our lives right now. One is that using facts that she has researched, she's telling new stories of American history, and we need to hear thousands more just like them so that we see how, in fact, diverse and varied and unusual we all are. And the other one is that the larger point of the book and the conversation that's come out now and the comments and the questions and the anecdotes is the idea of what a folly it is to look at difference as opposed to celebrate affinities, to celebrate family life and the journeys of grandparents to grandchildren. These are things we all have in common. And I would guess that in this room, just knowing my husband and knowing my own history, we've got people who are 5th and 6th generation Texans. We've got people who are 2nd generation Americans. I know people who are fancy New Yorkers, and they're all making contributions here that are adding to the richness, the intelligence, the compassion of our community and make this a place we want to be. And so Jan's book dug down into these stories we've never heard before, these histories that didn't even exist. And it gives us a chance to have this conversation again and again about why we're all in the room together tonight.
Well said.
I just wanted, I brought a few books, so, and they're, one of them, some of them are from the Lady Bird book a long time ago, and then the Train to Crystal City, and if you're interested, I just do it for $10 and you can see me back there. I want to just thank, it's so good to be in Austin It's so good to be with Nellie and Nellie White, John White's wife, all of these, with Pamela, because I was in school with her at UT, and of course the Taniguchi family, and we're just grateful, very grateful to be here, and thank you very much for your patience. All right.